Hello everyone. Very difficult topic for today, the problem of suffering. For me, the problem of suffering was always the ultimate obstacle raised by my mind whenever I try to make spiritual sense of the world. The nagging awareness that, at least in appearance, countless highly sentient beings seem to undergo absurd, unfathomable, senseless pain and suffering at all times throughout the world. This awareness would pose a big challenge towards the consistency of any all-encompassing, thorough spiritual outlook. So it's a very tough existential problem to be made sense of, to be rationalized, to be harmonized with any enlightened realization about the world. It's not for superficial reasons that it occupies a central role in Buddhism, for example, where the recognition of life as suffering stands as the first noble truth. And in the Abrahamic faiths as well, suffering is the very intrinsic manifestation or embodiment of our very separation from the divine, being traced to the so-called fall from grace. Although in their most esoteric and mystical interpretations, suffering is grace itself. In Gnosticism as well, suffering is the very experience that boundless consciousness goes through as it's being entrapped in matter. So it's the central part of worldly existence, because this imprisonment itself is anathema to the very nature of said consciousness. And the only way to transcend it is through gnosis, through this direct experience and realizing our essential nature. So there's this common motif or thread throughout many traditions of identifying suffering as separation. And I'm sure in our own so-called individual lives, we've recognized separation as a main source of suffering, whether it's separation from our parents, separation from our younger selves, separation from our ideals, separation from our identity, from our home. But it's all clinging to flowing water. It's the resistance to letting go that hurts. And in my own Vedantic outlook, pain is when our false and exclusive identification with the body forces itself on us, disguised as this undeniable truth. And it's also the friction between the ego and actual reality, and the ego's painful process of realizing and accepting its own unreality, clinging to a baseless existence. And the ego is none other than the mind. People like to distinguish between pain and suffering by saying pain is physical and suffering is mental, or rather suffering is this story that the mind weaves around pain or around fear most often. And I agree with that, but I'd like to observe how all so-called physicality is but a mental construct. And a mental construct is a nothing construct. But what I mean by that is that physical sensations are, in fact, mental sensations. When we stub our toe, we may feel that pain is located in our toe, but it's actually located in the mind. Without the mind, there's no pain, no suffering. The mind is the vigil over interpreting, receiving, recognizing any so-called physical evidence about a so-called physical world. And pain and pleasure are the most convincing aspects of samsara, while suffering is more of a part of Maya, the last bastion of Maya, so to say. But nonetheless, these are worlds of incomplete understanding, worlds of transience, And these realms of the mind, whenever threatened with transcendence, they'd always resort to their most persuasive of their aspects that could bring even the most realized being back into their fray. Because pain has the power to render an idealist into a materialist in an instant. And what I'd like to say now is that suffering is when we are convinced by untruth most intensely. It is the peak of mistaking the unreality of the mind and of the world for absolute reality. But the world is very analogous to a dream. And in that dream, things appear and disappear. And seemingly external entities are witnessed, some of them in agony. And we're asking ourselves, why must this suffering exist? What is its nature? What is its purpose? How do I put an end to it? Only to wake up and realize it was all made up of our own consciousness, disguising itself as other beings and their suffering. So who was suffering then? All so-called suffering was our own, except it held a lesser degree of reality and authenticity than our very own witnessing of it. It was a mere component of a dream in which the dreamer's witnessing is the only one true reality. So that witnessing is the only unfalsifiable thing that we can rely on. Whatever's secondary to it, whatever's contained within it, is of a lesser ontological nature than the witnessing itself. Whatever's contained within it could be faked for all we know. The only thing we can take for granted is that there is a witnessing of something. And it's that witnessing that holds the highest ontological ground. And it's that witnessing that we are, because there's little else for us to be. As people used to believe that the sun was the one revolving around the earth, based on misleading subjective evidence, so do we now believe that consciousness resides in our head, even though consciousness is the prerequisite for the awareness that such a thing as a head even exists. So, in conclusion, suffering is less real than you are. You are beyond transitory experience. If the highest degree of truth is universal truth, with its attributes of being immutable, changeless, perennial, intransient, then that is what you are, because that's what's likeliest for you to be. The impermanent and the transient cannot hope to make a dent in the absolute, in what is absolute. Or as Nisargadatta put it, what is real cannot die, and the unreal never lived. And I thank you very much, and much love to you.